Thanks for joining us today. We've got a very interesting topic to talk about, to say the least. Specifically, our topic today is Israel and its neighbors. What's next for the Middle East, and can the U.S. avoid being drawn into regional conflict? Well, we'll see. As we all know, by way of quick introduction, as we all know, Israel lives in a very dangerous neighborhood, virtually surrounded by mostly unfriendly regimes. But despite longstanding threats from Iran, Syria, Iraq, and the like, Israel has built a solid, respected position as a regional power that few adversaries would want to contend with. And very importantly, it recently made strategic advances in establishing new ties with the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, the Sudan, and Bahrain, a result of the Abraham Accords, which were signed 2 years ago. This breakthrough has helped to partially level the playing field in what is still a very complicated chessboard in the Middle East. And that game has been further complicated, I think, by last month's elections in Israel and the fact that Bibi Netanyahu has felt pressured to form a new alliance with two very extreme right-wing parties. So to make sense of all this shifting scenario, we're very fortunate today to welcome former Ambassador Martin Indyk as our speaker. Martin has had an illustrious career in the U.S. Foreign Service, serving twice as U.S. Ambassador to Israel, first from 1995 to 1997, and then from 2000 to 2001. Earlier, he served as director for Near East, you got it, and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the Clinton administration, and later as special envoy for Middle East peace during the Obama administration. He was a long-term fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he was director of the Center for Middle East Policy, and is currently a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And somehow, throughout all this, he has found the time to author 3 books on Middle East affairs. Among them is Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle Eastern Diplomacy. So without further ado, welcome, Ambassador. Thanks very much for giving us your time this morning, and we look forward to your remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tyler. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I look forward to an interesting conversation about current events in the region. But I wanted to begin by talking about some historical context. Sorry, I'm just trying to set up my camera here. Because, as Tyler mentioned, I just published this book. Where is it? Here, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. And I think it, although it is a book of deep history, it goes back to the origins of the American-led peace process between Israel and the Arab states under Henry Kissinger when he was Secretary of State in the 1970s. It nevertheless provides, I believe, a good context for what is happening in Israel and between Israel and its Arab neighbors, particularly the Palestinians, today. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I want to go back to where it all began and try to talk about the lessons that I learned from this deep dive into the Israeli and American archives and extensive conversations with Henry Kissinger himself about how he made peace in the Middle East and what it means for how to and how not to promote peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors today. The principal discovery I had in this forensic exercise, forensic because even though Henry Kissinger has written tens of thousands of pages about his experience as Secretary of State, including a lot on the Middle East. He tended to obfuscate what he was up to. And I have to say that as a student of Kissinger from my early days as a student in 1973, when he started to negotiate the ceasefire in the end of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and I was a student of international relations, happened to be in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University when the war broke out. But it turns out that I knew not Kissinger and what he was actually up to. So I want to spend just a few minutes on that because I think it has important lessons for the situation today. What I discovered was that Henry Kissinger was much more focused on trying to build a viable peace process than he was on trying to achieve peace. And the idea of pursuing a process has tended to get a bad reputation, especially amongst Americans who are inevitably impatient about the desire to achieve peace and the belief that it can simply be done if you come up with the right formula. Certainly that was the position of the presidents that I served, President Clinton and President Obama, when I tried to help them make peace in the Middle East. But it was also the position of many other presidents, from Nixon to Ford, and certainly even up to Trump, when it came to trying to grab the holy grail of peace in the Middle East. They all sought comprehensive solutions, sought to end the conflict in one great leap by designing an American plan to resolve the problems and then expecting both sides to accept it. Kissinger's, and by the way, guess what? They didn't. Kissinger's approach was far more incremental, far more conservative. And it was informed by a belief that the parties themselves were not ready to end their conflict, that would take a long time, decades, in his view, and that to try and force the pace of it and try to get to the end game straight away was actually to jeopardize the whole effort. He called it the paradox of peace, that the effort to achieve peace pursued with too much passion and ambition could actually produce the opposite, that is to say, war. Now, he was informed by his own experience, having fled from the Nazis in Germany, where 14 of his closest family were murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Coming to the United States and then going back to Germany as part of the US Army. He was very seized by the way in which the pursuit of peace before that war, in other words, appeasement, had actually laid the foundations or the conditions for Hitler's aggression. And his previous understanding of what had happened after the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson had tried to achieve a peace to end all wars, and that brought us the Second World War. So he had a very jaundiced view of peacemaking, and particularly when it came to the Middle East. He believed that the Arabs weren't ready to end their conflict with Israel, and that Israel wasn't in a position to make the territorial concessions that would be necessary in order to achieve that peace. Now, let me do a little footnote there, just in case some of you aren't familiar with what he had in mind by territorial concessions. Israel in 1967, in the Six-Day War, ended up taking control of large amounts of Arab territory, all of the Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal in Egypt, all of the Golan Heights in Syria in the north, and all of the West Bank up to the Jordan River, and including Jerusalem in the east. And the acquisition of that territory, the occupation of that territory, was understood by the international community, manifested in UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was accepted by all of the parties, including Israel, that there should be a withdrawal of Israeli forces from the territory it occupied in 1967 in exchange for secure and recognized borders and peace with its neighbors. And that formula of territory for peace has underpinned the whole effort to make peace between Israel and the Arabs. That is to say, the Arabs would offer peace to Israel, normalization of relations, security arrangements, and recognition. And in return, Israel would give up territory it occupied in 67. Not necessarily all the territory, but territories. The basic principle was that it would withdraw from those territories. And so when Kissinger came along to make peace after the 1973 war, he picked up that formula. But because his approach was conservative and incremental, because he didn't believe that Israel could afford to make, the large territorial concessions that could achieve a final peace, he instead went for what he called step-by-step diplomacy. It was an incremental approach in which Israel would give up some territory in return for some steps by the Arabs towards peace. But he eschewed the idea that you could resolve the conflict in one grand leap. And even in the negotiations that he had with Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister the first time in the 1970s, and even Hafez al-Assad of Syria, when they told him that their people were ready for peace, that they were ready for the big step, they were ready to end the conflict, he always said, wait a minute, let's not go there. Let's not try to end the conflict. Let's just work towards it. Let's just build confidence. For the Israelis, he had to convince them to give up territory. And to do that in the wake of a war in which they had been attacked by Egypt and Syria. And Golda Meir, who was the prime minister at the time, was extremely reluctant to do that. Given his own jaundiced attitude towards peace, his approach was to argue that they should give up territory for time for the Arabs eventually to come to terms with Israel, and time for Israel to strengthen itself, to reduce its isolation, to put itself in a position where, with the support of the United States, it would eventually be able to make the ultimate territorial concessions when the Arabs were ready to make the ultimate concession of recognition of Israel ending the conflict and making peace with it. So that was his approach. He called it step-by-step diplomacy. And as I said, it was not the approach of those that came after him, including myself. But it was the approach that Yitzhak Rabin adopted in 1993, when, as prime minister the second time, he decided that he would reach out and make peace with the Palestinians, with Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And he adopted a pure Kissingerian approach, as I've described it. Few of you will know the details of the Oslo Accords, but the Oslo Accords provided for an incremental step-by-step approach in which the issue of borders, Jerusalem, refugees, all of that and statehood for the Palestinians. All of that was put off until sometime in the future. And instead, the Palestinians would receive small pieces of territory in 3 phases of Israeli army withdrawal from the West Bank and from Gaza, which would eventually lead to a final status negotiation on what the borders and the issues like Jerusalem and refugees would be, and what the status of the Palestinian entity would be, whether it would be a state or something less than that. That was Rabin's approach in the Oslo Accords. And while he was still alive before he was assassinated, there was 2 steps taken, which led to the Palestinians taking control of 40% of the West Bank and most of Gaza. And subsequently, Bibi Netanyahu came along as prime minister in his first term, and he executed a 3rd step of a 13% withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. I'm sorry, I got the figures wrong. Rabin's withdrawals were 27%, then there was a 13% from Netanyahu, which amounted to 40% of the West Bank, which is the territory which the Palestinian Authority nominally controls today in the West Bank, with the other 60% up for negotiations. Now, let's fast forward to today. Today, after a variety of attempts, culminating in Trump's deal of the century, you had American presidents from Bill Clinton on laying out what the United States thought should be the disposition of the territory and the final status issues such as Jerusalem and refugees. In the Clinton parameters, it was about 95% of the West Bank would go to the Palestinians, 80% of the settlers who had settled in the West Bank would be absorbed into Israel where they lived, because they were living in blocks in about 5% of the territory. And there would be a compensation for the Palestinians for the 5% of that territory that they would give up from territory that was in Israel proper along the border. There'd be an adjustment of the border. I won't go into all the other details, but that was essentially the deal that was offered by Clinton and accepted by Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. And we never got an answer from Yasser Arafat. He ran away. Donald Trump proposed 70% of the West Bank would go to the Palestinians. And there would also be swaps of Israeli territory in that arrangement. He not negotiated that with the Palestinians, and therefore Palestinians had rejected it from the get-go. Netanyahu indicated a willing, when he was prime minister under Trump, expressed a willingness to accept that idea, but then he was faced with such opposition from his right wing and from the settlers that he backed away from that. And so there was no acceptance even of a 70% solution in which Israel would annex 30% of the territory. But instead, something unexpected happened, as often happens in the Middle East. And the pressure from Netanyahu, supported by Trump, to annex that 30% of the territory as laid out in Trump's vision of peace, led the United Arab Emirates under their leader, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, to try to head off the annexation by offering full normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel instead. It was an offer of normalization for no annexation. And since Netanyahu was under pressure not to accept the Trump plan and get the 30% annexation. He instead went for this deal with the UAE, which became the Abraham Accords. And Trump administration, Jared Kushner and his deputy, Avi Berkowitz in particular, pursued that opening to their credit, and three other Arab countries signed up to normalization with Israel: Morocco, Bahrain, and to some extent Sudan, although Sudan has become a little more complicated. But three of them certainly signed up for full normalization and peace with Israel. Going back to Kissinger for a moment, that's precisely what he expected, that it would take 40 years before the Arabs would come to accept Israel. But eventually they would. And they did in this case. And now we have a new government about to be formed in Israel. As Tyler mentioned, it's a government that has extreme right-wing parties in the coalition. It's a right-wing, religious, extreme right-wing coalition of parties. And the extreme right-wing parties have as their number one priority annexing the West Bank territory. There's up to 60% of it that is still in Israel's control. And they are pushing Netanyahu to agree in the coalition agreements before the government is even formed to legalize illegal settlements that are illegal under Israeli law, to extend Israeli civil administration to the Israeli settlers, the 350,000 settlers that live in the West Bank, and eventually to annex as much as they can, both the settlements and the Jordan Valley. And Netanyahu, under pressure because he needs their support, has started down that road. We'll see how far he goes once the government is formed, but he's made them various promises. And this will challenge the Abraham Accords Arab countries, precisely because the UAE stopped the annexation in exchange for normalizing with Israel. And so therefore it's going to, depending on how far Netanyahu goes, and we don't know yet how he'll respond to this pressure, but it has the potential to jeopardize those accords, and certainly to deter other Arab states from joining up if it goes down the road that these extremist parties in his coalition want to or are insisting that he do. In the meantime, situation in the West Bank itself has deteriorated quite dramatically in the last 6 months. And you would probably have noticed that the incidents of violence and terrorism that has emanated from the West Bank cities is like a steady drumbeat. Over 30 Israelis have been killed by terrorist acts coming out of the West Bank. Over 145 Palestinians have been killed as a result of the response of the Israeli army. And that is ratcheting up tensions in the West Bank at a time when the Palestinian Authority under Abu Mazen, Palestinian leader, that authority has been crumbling. It now essentially only controls Ramallah, the main city in the West Bank. It doesn't control the other cities and towns throughout the area that is under its nominal authority. And as a result, it's become kind of like the Wild West. Weapons galore, a target-rich environment of settlers, hundreds of thousands of settlers that are easy prey, and a young population of 20-year-olds or so on the Palestinian side who don't remember the Intifada, who were only infants, if that, when it raged across the West Bank and caused such pain and disruption of life for the Palestinians there. And so the combination of rising terrorism and Israel's response in the West Bank, crumbling Palestinian Authority, and a new right-wing government with an extremist arm that's going to be pushing the government to take more action to support the settlers, protect them, and take over more territory in the West Bank, territory which the Palestinians, of course, claim as well. And you have a recipe for an explosion. I was in Israel 2 weeks ago, talked to the main security chiefs on the Israeli side, and they were all convinced that the next explosion was on its way, that the fuse had in effect already been lit. So unfortunately, it's a combustible situation in which it's going to be very hard to see how the United States could head this off, given the fact that we have so many other higher priorities at the moment in dealing with Putin's aggression in Ukraine and China's rise in the East. But I do think that we are going to have to respond. Indeed, if it does explode, we will have to respond with another effort to try to calm things down and create a peaceful horizon. And that means create a peace process. And if and when we come back to that, I hope that we'll pursue the Kissingerian incremental approach, taking some small steps to try to come out of this deteriorating situation in a way that helps to build confidence rather than attempt to try to resolve the conflict yet again with some made in America plan that has no choice of succeeding. Thanks, Tyler. I'm happy to go to Q&A. Tyler, I think you're on mute.
You are right. I was on mute. Yeah. Thanks again for a very enlightening discussion. More to this combustible situation where Netanyahu's been forced to ally with the very radical right-wing parties. How do you think that is going to resonate in two different places, Tehran and Washington?
Let me quibble with one word you used there, Tyler, because I think it's important. Netanyahu was not forced into this coalition. Netanyahu forged this coalition. He brought these two extremist parties together so that they would succeed in getting the votes that they did. He was responsible for that. He brought into this coalition that those two parties gave him 63 votes in his coalition together with the religious parties. He brought in another extremist with one vote that he's given control of the external education curriculum, which is causing huge problems in Israel at the moment, huge protests. So I just don't agree that he was forced to do this. There were other ways in which he could have formed his coalition, but he chose to do this. In a sense, he made his bed. He clearly believes that he can control them. And he may be right. From my own experience as ambassador to Israel, dealing with 5 prime ministers in the 2 times that I was there, they have immense authority under their system. And he's got enough of a majority with 64 votes. He needs 61 to govern. He's got enough of a majority that he can afford to stand up to them. So we'll see how he plays it. And that will become very important in terms of your question of how he deals with the United States. As you probably know, the President Biden is committed to what's referred to as the two-state solution, meaning a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, which provides for the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, living alongside Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, in peace and security. But if Netanyahu gives way to the demands of these extreme right-wing parties that I've explained to you in my remarks, then he will be doing things that directly undermine the potential for a viable Palestinian state living alongside Israel. In other words, undermine the two-state solution. So I don't think the Biden administration is going to quietly accept those actions. Secretary of State Blinken gave a speech this weekend to an organization which some of you may know called J Street, which is a kind of progressive pro-Israel organization that's committed to the two-state solution. And he made clear that the United States will unequivocally oppose the kind of settlement activity that the extreme right-wing parties are committed to and are trying to commit Netanyahu to as well. So we'll have to see how he plays one off against the other. If he bends to the demands of the extremist right-wing parties, he's going to have a problem with the United States. But if he respects the red lines coming from the Biden administration, he's going to have a problem with his right wing. So I can't predict yet exactly how he's going to play this game, but I think that there's enough concern in Washington about the pressure that he's going to be under that they've decided to make it clear to him quietly, and not so quietly in terms of what Secretary of State Blinken said this weekend, that there are American red lines and he would do well not to cross them. On the question of Iran, this is, for Netanyahu, one of his two top priorities. He wants to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and he wants to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. Those are his top two priorities. And of course, they're related. As you said in your introduction, the common threat that Iran poses to the Sunni Arab states, starting with Saudi Arabia, and to Israel, which the Iranians threaten on every other day to destroy, means that they have a common interest in containing and deterring Iran. And so Netanyahu leading the effort to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons has a benefit in terms of helping him to achieve his second objective, which is normalization with Saudi Arabia. The more he succeeds in deterring Iran, the more the Saudis will be in his debt. But he can't succeed in deterring Iran without close cooperation with the Biden administration. And therefore, he can't afford to get into a confrontation with the Biden administration in order to achieve his strategic objectives. People will recall that he did get into a confrontation with the Obama administration over the nuclear agreement that Obama negotiated with the Iranians. That nuclear agreement is something which the Biden administration has been trying to get Iran to rejoin after Trump tore up the agreement and Iranians exited it. So that effort to get them to rejoin a nuclear agreement, which Netanyahu strongly, vehemently opposes, has the potential to create friction in another area between Biden and Netanyahu. But it looks like the nuclear agreement is on its deathbed, partly because the Iranians are making demands which are unacceptable, not just to the United States, but the other signatories to the JCPOA. And because Iran, of course, is beating up and killing its own civilians, particularly women, in the streets of Tehran, and at the same time providing missiles and drones to Russia so that it can bomb Ukrainian civilians. And in that circumstance, I don't see that the Biden administration is likely to come back into the agreement and lift sanctions and give the Iranian regime tens of billions of dollars at a time when they're acting in this nefarious way. So there is actually a potential here for Netanyahu to reach agreement with Biden on what the next steps are in dealing with Iran. Biden, too, has committed that he will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. And so they have a potential for some common ground here, which can, if you follow the way everything's connected in the Middle East, which can rebound to the benefit of the process of normalization with Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Peter, I think you may have a question.
Yes,
Peter?
thank you. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, you've spoken about the Israeli views and stake in the territorial area and the possible concessions. But I've understood that from the Palestinian side, and I'd ask you to try to address both the Israeli Arabs' perspective and that of the people in the occupied territories in the West Bank. Some have suggested that they've really shifted from the commitment or the goal of national rights, the two-state solution, in many ways perhaps given up on it, and are following a strategy of focusing much more on human rights and trying to gain more of an equal voice and status that way. Appreciate your comment.
Yes, thank you, Peter. It is an important development and one that stems from an understandable disillusionment with the idea of a two-state solution, which has been tried and failed numerous times. Certainly tried and failed by me, and tried and failed by Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and so on. So it's a bipartisan failure here. And so it's not surprising that the Palestinians, when they look at the way their settlement movement has taken over critical parts of the West Bank, that they don't believe anymore that it's possible or likely. And so they've shifted to, at least some of them have shifted to this demand, as you said, for equal rights in Israel. And say, make us citizens, give us equal rights as Israel's Arab citizens have under the law in Israel. And we'll settle for that. What they have in mind is to turn Israel from being a Jewish state into a binational state, an Arab and Jewish or Palestinian and Jewish state. And indeed, if Israel were to give them the equal rights that some of them now demand, then they would constitute, together with Israel's Arabs, a majority in the territory that Israel controlled. And so if they have equal rights, including voting rights, they would be able to, if they were able to put a coherent state together, take control of the government. They would be able to turn Israel from a Jewish state to a binational state. Why would Israel cooperate in such a scheme? Unlikely. I would say not going to happen. They're not about to hand over the keys to the Palestinians and give up on the whole Zionist enterprise because the Palestinians are demanding equal rights. And I think the Palestinians know that. I think that the Palestinian demand for equal rights is a way of highlighting the fact that they don't have these rights under occupation, an occupation which has lasted for 50 years now. And so it's an attempt to advance their argument that they are in fact living in what they refer to as an apartheid state with one rule of law for Israelis and another rule of law for Palestinians. And that is an argument that they hope to get a boost from what the new government in Israel will do in the West Bank, creating an even more clear two-tier system. And that will advance their cause through the international community on the South African model, sanctions that lead eventually to the collapse of the state. So I think that is the strategy. May not surprise you that I think it's a terrible mistake for them, that this is not going to succeed. And in the end, they will have given up something which they have achieved, which is the recognition of the international community, starting with the United States, for their right to a state, their right to self-determination. That's what Biden's support for a two-state solution is all about. And that was Trump's support for a two-state solution too in the end. And going back, all the way back to the days of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and so on. So I think that, well, actually, I'm exaggerating there because the Palestinian issue wasn't really on the agenda there. But it was Bill Clinton at first, and then George W. Bush, who recognized the Palestinians' right to an independent state. And I think it's a big mistake, just because you can't get there from here to just give up on it for an approach that, in my view, is also bound to fail. Because in the end, if you really want a peaceful solution, then there is no alternative to Israelis and Palestinians separating and living in two states side by side with mutual recognition. This recipe for demanding equal rights is just going to continue the conflict. And it's not going to solve the problem for the Palestinians any more than it will for Israel.
Tyler, could I ask a question?
You sure may, yes.
Sorry you can't see me. I was just curious about the role now of Jerusalem. We seem to have that as an issue that's gone by somehow. And I wondered what you thought of its present status and its future.
Is that Don? Do I see
Yeah,
you?
I'm Don, and I guess I have not been accepted to join you somehow.
Okay.
He's there, so you can't see me, but I do exist.
Virtually, yes. So I'm glad you brought up the case of Jerusalem because it is far from receded in importance, and it was my mistake not to make that clear. When we talk about a combustible situation in the West Bank, it's equally combustible in Jerusalem. But in Jerusalem, it has the potential to be even more so because of the religious dimensions associated with Jerusalem. And in particular, as you're no doubt aware, the area where the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, is located, is on what's called the Haram al-Sharif. The Israelis and Jews everywhere call it the Temple Mount, because that compound, which includes the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the mosque called the Dome of the Rock, which is that beautiful golden domed rock, mosque, is built on the ruins of the Second Temple, which is Judaism's holiest site. So there's an inevitable friction and between Jewish claims and Muslim claims in that area. And because of that, successive Israeli governments have decreed that Jews should not pray there to reduce the friction, but also because the leading rabbis, the chief rabbis in Israel, have consistently said that Jews should not pray there because they're not sure exactly where the holy ground is, and they would be desecrating it if they were to walk on it. So they don't even want them going up there, but let alone praying up there. So that has been what's called the status quo. Jews have access to the compound, along with others, and tourists and so on. But the Muslims, the Waqf, the Holy Trust, controls the area, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Muslims go to pray. And on the side of the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount is the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, which is the holiest site in Judaism, just down below. And so it's very easy for conflict to arise and Palestinians start throwing stones over the wall to the Jewish people who are praying below. And then the police move in and they run into the mosque and all hell breaks loose. And then Hamas in Gaza with its rockets wants to show that it's protecting the mosque, and so they start to fire rockets, and pretty soon we've got a war. That's what happened last year, and could easily happen now. And it could easily spread. The situation I'm describing in the West Bank could easily spread to Jerusalem. And that's before you have problems like in Sheikh Jarrah and other Arab suburbs of Jerusalem, where again, the same people who are supported by these extremist right-wing parties are moving into Arab parts of inner East Jerusalem. And that creates tension as well. So it's all a very combustible brew. Netanyahu is familiar with this problem. He's committed in the past to maintaining the status quo. But again, we'll have to see how it plays out with the pressure that he's going to be under.
Tyler, could I ask a second question? Thank you for that. Thank you for your answer. But I was also curious, coming back to America, whether the support for Israel now with the new government, etc., remains as high as it's been in the past. And looking at other people who involve themselves, for example, the Christian evangelicals are also interested in supporting Jews. So I was curious as to, at times, under Obama and some of the others, the support for Israel has not been as strong as it might have been in the past. I wondered if, coming back to America, what your sense is.
Yes. That. Well, there's been an important trend in American public opinion towards Israel that has developed over more than a decade. But the trend is for Republican support for Israel to increase, at the same time as Democratic support for Israel has been decreasing. I'm not talking at the level of the president, I'm talking at the level of the the grassroots. And there is now a 40-point difference. 70% of Republicans support Israel, 30% of Democrats. Quite dramatic. And that's finally manifesting itself in the Democratic representation in Congress. And that's why you see the Squad and others there vocally critical of Israel. And they are supported by progressives in the base of the Democratic Party that gives them some strength. Still, the mainstream of the party is pro-Israel. President Biden is fundamentally pro-Israel. He's from what you call the old guard in that regard. But on the other side, you have, as you mentioned, Christian evangelicals who are strongly in support of Israel. And because they form a real core support for the Republican Party, one can expect that separation to continue. Now, there's another factor here, which is American Jews. They have traditionally, and remain today, the stalwarts of the Democratic Party. There's a reason that Donald Trump complains about them all the time, is because 70% of them vote Democrat religiously in an orthodox kind of way. They are liberal Democrats and will be for the foreseeable future. And of course, traditionally, they've been pro-Israel and strong advocates for Israel. But now there's a question mark over that, which relates again to what the new government in Israel will do. Because the extreme right-wing parties, not content with the agenda I've already described, also want to turn Israel into what they call a halachic state, meaning they want it to be more Jewish and less democratic. They want to promote a redefinition of the question of who is a Jew, which could, in effect, treat the Reform Jews of America, who represent the majority of American Jews, as non-Jews under their definition. And so there's a high potential here for tension and conflict, political conflict between American Jews and this new government in Israel. And that can affect the support in the Democratic Party for Israel as well. So we'll see how it plays itself out. I think that President Biden will remain true to his long-held beliefs and want to work closely with the new government. And Netanyahu will be welcomed here and try to work out a way forward and an understanding. And hopefully we'll avoid a kind of worst-case scenario there for the U.S.-Israel relationship. But the potential is there for a significant drop-off in support.
Ambassador, I have two questions from the audience. One, I'll rephrase. Has the violence that has emanated from Gaza in recent years, we all know about that, has that, in your view, permanently poisoned any sense in the Israeli government that they can ever exchange territory for peace?
Yes, it's a good question. And the short answer is yes. Because of the experience in Gaza, combined with the fact that previous efforts at peacemaking, as I've described them, in which Israeli governments made generous offers to the Palestinians, to which the Palestinian leadership did not respond, that combined with what the question referred to as the violence rocket fire coming out of Gaza, has done much to convince the Israelis that they don't have a Palestinian partner. And the violence out of Gaza is particularly effective in forcing that conclusion on the Israelis. Because the Israelis, as you may know, withdrew completely from Gaza, uprooted all of the settlements, took the army out of there, and handed it over to the Palestinian Authority. And within a year, Hamas took over and started building its rockets, smuggling them in, and then firing them at Israel. And Israelis look at that experience and say, well, if we hand over the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority, it'll be taken over by Hamas. It'll become Hamas-stan, as they refer to it. And rockets from there into Israel will be far more deadly than the rockets coming from Gaza, just because of the proximity of the West Bank to Israel's main population center in the Tel Aviv, Haifa metropolis. So that, combined with the fact that you've got, in effect, two Palestinian authorities, one that nominally rules in 40% of the West Bank, and the other that completely rules and has complete control in Gaza. And Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are at loggerheads. They don't agree on anything. And Hamas would dearly like to take over, topple the Palestinian Authority and take over in the West Bank. And the only reason they haven't been able to do that is because of Israel, because of the presence of the Israeli army there. So this combination of the fact that we don't, on the Palestinian side, have a unified actor to deal with, for Israel to deal with, the fact that even if Israel were to do a deal with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, what is going to happen with Gaza is a reasonable question that has no sensible answer. And the fact that Hamas is dedicated to Israel's destruction, all of that combines to convince Israelis that they don't have a partner for peace, and therefore they have no choice but to continue the occupation. But continuing the occupation is one thing. Taking over the West Bank, annexing it to Israel unilaterally is completely another thing. And that's something that the international community in the United States is not going to go for, just because the Palestinians are feckless and unable to get their act together in a way that could present Israel with a meaningful peace partner.
Well, speaking of the West Bank, another question is, I guess, in essence, how does one define annexation? I mean, how would it work? Is there any kind of annexation that would be palatable conceivably to all parties? Probably not, but maybe.
Right. So it's an interesting question. So the annexation that would be acceptable to all parties is an annexation that comes out of an agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians, endorsed by the international community and brokered by the United States, in which the Palestinians agree that Israel would annex, let's say, 5, 10, maybe even, if the Trump plan were to come to fruition, 30%, although I don't imagine that would be acceptable. But in principle, the Palestinians do not reject the idea that Israel will annex some of the West Bank where the settlements are. Settlements are built, most of them are in blocks along what was the 67 lines. And that's why I said that under the Clinton parameters, 80% of the settlers could be absorbed in 5% of the territory. And then the Palestinians would be compensated with 5% of territory from other parts of Israel, an idea that's included in the Trump plan, by the way. And so that's how the annexation would work. And Palestinian leadership has repeatedly accepted that idea of what they call mutually agreed swaps of territory. So that's how annexation could happen in as part of a peace agreement. Then there's, at the other extreme, unilateral annexation, which is what the extreme right-wing parties and a fair part of the Likud would also like to do, in which Israel simply does what it did in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and declares that this territory is Israel's, passes the law formally annexing and converting it from occupied territory, in which the Geneva Conventions apply to territory occupied as a result of war, to parts of sovereign Israel. And that's what they're pushing to do, and almost did before the Crown Prince of the UAE came along and offered normalization instead. The problem with that effort, and Netanyahu understands this very clearly, is that nobody's going to recognize it. It's certainly not the United States. So it'll be a unilateral land grab, if you like, that won't be recognized. And so Israel can act like it's theirs, but without international recognition, it's going to be used by the Palestinians in international forums like the Security Council, like the International Criminal Court, and like the International Court of Justice, to make the argument that Israel's engaged in illegal occupation, war crimes, etc., etc. And since that unilateral annexation would be so opposed by the United States for the reason that I've said, there would be a big question mark about whether the United States would protect Israel from those kinds of international efforts in those circumstances. So it's a road that is fraught with problems. As I said, I think that Netanyahu understands it. I'm sure he does, actually. But he's going to be under severe pressure to try to do that. Finally, there is what's known as de facto annexation. And de facto annexation is a process, if you like, it's kind of creeping annexation, where Israel has established settlements throughout the West Bank. As I said, most of them are concentrated close to Israel's original border, but many of them are peppered deep into the West Bank. If you Google a map of West Bank settlements, you'll see what I mean. They're dotted all over the place. And there are, as well as those settlements, 200 illegal outposts. These are outposts set up by the settlers across the West Bank, on the hills. They are illegal under Israeli law. In other words, they just went ahead and did it. They didn't get any, there was no government approval of this. And now the extremist parties are pushing to legalize them. By the way, they call them youthful settlements because they're full of young, fired up Israeli settlers. But they are illegal. And nevertheless, as part of this de facto annexation process, if they legalize them and then connect them to the other settlements, as is their intention, then in effect, Israel will be controlling much of the territory, other than the 40% that's already been handed over to the Palestinians, will be controlling it de facto by building settlements across the 60%. And that kind of de facto annexation doesn't involve a declaration, doesn't require American recognition or not. And to borrow from Kissinger, it's an incremental approach, a step-by-step approach. So if you think about what I described as the consequences of a formal annexation, I think that the way this is going to be handled is a de facto annexation process in which Netanyahu can say, I'm not annexing the territory, but the settlers can understand that in the process of legalizing illegal settlements, expanding Israeli civilian law to the settlers in the West Bank, all of these processes will lead to de facto annexation and who knows, eventually a formal annexation.
Okay, to change the focus just a bit, as you know, we were discussing this before the session. Bibi Netanyahu has published a memoir, 700 plus pages, ought to make interesting reading. And I hope that they buy more of your book before folks buy Bibi's book. But in any case, I'm sure it'll raise a lot of provocative questions. Among other things, apparently he scathingly criticizes both President Clinton and President Obama for their roles and the pressure they put on him and Israel in past negotiations. And I know you were intimately involved at that time in your ambassadorial role. Could you comment on what you think, and I don't know what those criticisms are, but what you would assume they would be?
Yeah, neither do I, Tyler. I haven't read the book, so I don't know what exactly his criticism is. But the relationship between the United States and Israel is a very close one, and Israel is highly dependent on the support it gets from the United States. That support is bipartisan. Has been for a long time. And notwithstanding Netanyahu's efforts to turn it into a partisan issue, which he did last time he was prime minister, by going behind the back of President Obama and playing to the Republicans and placing all of his bets with Donald Trump. And you know, I mean, he took actions that were designed to build the Republican support and reduce Democratic support. So, I feel that he's really undermined and helped those on the Democratic side who have turned against Israel. He's just helped them to make it a partisan issue, which I think is a huge mistake. But having said all that, there is bipartisan support for Israel. It's a bedrock there. And nevertheless, there are times when the United States and Israel are at loggerheads. I detail a real knockdown, drag-out fight that Henry Kissinger had with Yitzhak Rabin back in the 1970s. And so it's not unusual in the nature of a relationship between a superpower and a small power, which see things necessarily differently from their different perspectives, geopolitical location. You started off by noting, Tyler, that Israel is a country surrounded by hostility. Well, it's not entirely the case anymore, as you also pointed out, because of the peace treaties it has with Israel and Egypt, and now with the Abraham Accords countries, and a kind of de facto peace with Saudi Arabia. But Israel's in a tough situation. And the United States as superpower is in a very different situation. Israel faces real threats from Iran. And Israel, I don't think, can live with an Iranian bomb. And we can, just like we live with the North Korean bomb and a Pakistani bomb. And so inevitably, our perspectives are going to be different, no matter how much support there is. And when those differences occur, because the relationship is so lopsided in terms of power between a superpower and a small power, there's inevitably pressure in the relationship, or a sense or a belief that there's pressure in the relationship. When we think that Israel should give up territory according to principles that it has signed up to and agreed to, and it doesn't. That creates tension. We have always, consecutive Republican and Democratic presidents have always opposed Israel's settlement activity. And yet when it continues to act in ways that go against what American Republican or Democratic presidents consider the American national interest, so they stand up for the American national interest and tell the Israelis, don't do that. And it was George H.W. Bush that imposed economic sanctions on Israel because of settlement activity. So I think that the question of pressure, first of all, is not just a Democratic one at all. Secondly, Democratic and Republican administrations all prefer to work with Israel rather than against it, put their arm around Israel and try to get it to move in the direction the United States cares about, rather than to engage in pressure on it. And since Henry Kissinger, there hasn't been an instance where American supply of military assistance to Israel has been held up, notwithstanding some very real differences between the United States and Israel in the context of the peace process or the context of dealing with Iran. So I don't know what Netanyahu's complaints are in particular, but I think that Israel, if you look at the broad picture, has benefited hugely from the bipartisan support that the United States has provided it, the massive economic and now military assistance that the United States provides, the diplomatic and political support that Israel enjoys. So I think when people cry out about pressure, they should keep it in context.
Well, you mentioned during your last answer nuclear bombs and power, and here's a question that we hope we don't have to face in the near-term future at least. But if Iran was to become provoked and scare the world by making an existential threat to Israel, do you think Israel is capable of taking out Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz and Fordow and so forth, if push came to shove? You may not know the answer, but I'm just curious what your thoughts might be.
Well, this is a subject of considerable debate today in Israel. And Israel, as you would know, has never allowed any other country in the region to acquire the nuclear capabilities that Iran has now acquired. When the Iraqis built a nuclear plant and started to to get weapons-grade material from plutonium production, the Israelis bombed the Osirak nuclear reactor. When the Syrians got a reactor from North Korea, before they could even commission it, the Israelis bombed that reactor. Both cases put them out of business. But they haven't done it in the Iranian case. And now the Iranians are on the threshold of a nuclear capability. Not so much the ability to make bombs, but the access to the nuclear material that can be used to make bombs. They have enriched enough uranium now, today, at 60% enrichment for 4 bombs. It would take them, according to IAEA estimates, between days and weeks to enrich that to 90%. That would give them nuclear weapons grade material to make a bomb. The Israelis believe there's still 12 to 18 months from being able to actually make the bomb reduced size so that they can put it on missiles. They have the missiles, short, medium, and long range missiles that they could use. So that the Israelis feel that they still have time. But now that the Iranians are at the threshold, well beyond, as I said, anything that they've been prepared to live with in the Middle East, they have to think about what it is they're going to do. Clearly, they are preparing for that strike that you talked about, trying to destroy the Iranian nuclear facilities. But the Iranians, knowing this, are taking their facilities underground, where they're much harder to hit. It's even harder to know exactly where they are and what they're doing down there. And of course, Iran is a long distance from Israel. They couldn't achieve it without refueling, and they need refuelers from the United States. They need bigger bombs from the United States. But they are building that capability, even as they start to debate whether they can live with Iranian bomb. How could that work, you say, given that one bomb from Iran could destroy all of Israel? But the Israelis have I'll start that sentence again. The Israelis are reported to have a effective nuclear triad. That is to say, an ability to strike Iran, reportedly, with nuclear weapons from the air, from aircraft, from missiles, and from submarines. And so were the Iranians to contemplate destroying Israel, as they declare at every opportunity, they would have to also contemplate that their entire country would be destroyed as well. And so the Israelis have to think about, do we bomb Iran in the hope that we destroy their nuclear facilities? But then they'll take it underground and we won't really know what happens to it. Or do they live with an Iranian bomb, relying on the potential for a bomb? The Iranians don't have a bomb yet. Relying on nuclear deterrence, mutually assured destruction, to deter Iran from going down that road. It's a very tough decision for them to make. I think that Netanyahu will be quite determined to develop a military strike capability and to press the United States to do the same. But it's by no means a simple operation anymore. And it's not at all clear that it will be successful.
Well, on that note, I think given both an ominous but moderately encouraging answer to my question, I think it's time to wrap it up. And we most appreciate the time you've taken to entertain us and enlighten us. And we thank you very, very much. So that is the end of the session. And Ambassador, we really appreciate your efforts and your time. So thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay.